Hi, my name is Yasar Kondakci. I'm from the Middle East Technical University, which is located in Ankara, Turkey. And today I will talk about academic leadership in times of disruptions. I will talk about some key forces of change emanating from the external environment, the impact of these forces of change on academic cultures, and possible reaction of academic leadership in order to respond to these forces of change. I believe the whole story of change and transformation in higher education has started at the end of 1970s. Several different political and economic developments during that time have forced academic institutions, higher education organizations to change aspects in their structures and functions. Neoliberal movements in world economies and the public finance crisis, which results from these movements, and then the collapse of the communist bloc in the world and the resulting economic globalization have been pushing higher education institutions to drastically reconsider different aspects of their structures and functions. As I said, there are several different forces of change, and each of these forces have been pushing higher education institutions to change their structural and functional characteristics in the first place, and then, of course, these forces have implications on academic cultures. If we name some of these forces of change, in the first place, changing demography. Changing demography have resulted in increasing numbers, increasing demand for higher education, increasing diversity, growing diversity, and as a result of growing diversity and growing numbers, the higher education institutions were obliged to change their structural and functional characteristics. For example, higher education institutions developed specific services for students with disabilities. They developed some specific services for international students. The implication of changing demography on academic cultures is that the universities need to adopt diversified offerings. They need to demonstrate inclusive education, individualized services, and they need to develop flexible programs for non-traditional students. Of course, one of the biggest challenges that higher education institutions have faced is related to the developments in technology, developments specifically in information and communication technologies. Developments in technology have resulted in new modes of academic practices and delivery, flexible delivery reaching more and more students and provide better access to non-traditional students, decreasing the cost of program delivery, diversified ways of advertising programs, and widening the variety and strength of international relations. Of course, the total impact of developments in technology on academic cultures is the introduction of openness understanding, open science, open teaching, open courses, open education have been a pervading value surrounding the practice of academic institutions. Participative campus, participative practices is another implication on higher education institutions' culture. I do believe that the neoliberal movements at the end of 1970s and the implication of these movements on the modes of public finance is one of the key developments which has resulted in huge disruptions on higher education institutions in the West. So neoliberal movements resulted in new modes of university governance. We witnessed the introduction of business model functioning in higher education, and we witnessed new leadership approaches, marketization of economy, new modes of performance evaluation, introduction of rankings and accreditation, performance evaluation, standardization, and the concern to align with Anglo-Saxon higher education system, which is believed to be more efficient one, are some of the implications of the neoliberal movements in higher education, at least in the western part of the world. Of course, these developments have resulted in huge changes in academic culture of Western universities. So corporate culture, business-like management values and orientations such as productivity, efficiency, reshaping key values of the academy, reshaping key values of the university, for example, academic freedom, intellectual space, priority for knowledge serving societal needs, introduction of marketization, competition, introduction of entrepreneurship into the university, and internationalization are some of the implications of neoliberal movements in the long term, of course, on academic cultures. Increasing political pressure is another development which has resulted in structural and functional change on the part of higher education institutions. Increased reporting, scrutiny, pressure to maintain high standards, defining new modes of governance and organization of higher education institutions, and change in authority relationship between governmental bodies and universities are some of the structural and functional implications of increasing political pressure on the universities. Accountability, tight coupled organization, and machine bureaucracies, adopting machine bureaucracies are some of the implications of political interventions on academic culture. Different countries, different higher education systems have experienced the impact of these forces more or less in the same way. For example, De Boer and his colleagues indicated that in the Netherlands, loosely coupled systems, professional bureaucracies, collegial organizations, organized anarchies have changed into tightly coupled systems, corporate, entrepreneurial, enterprise, or service model characteristics with the aim of transforming fragmented mode of governance into more what they call complete organization. In other words, Dutch universities have moved from traditional academic model and structures into more corporate-like what they call again complete organizations. Similar cases have been reported by Krutschken and his colleagues for Germany. Krutschken indicated a shift in university administration in Germany towards an integrated, goal-oriented, and competitive entity in which management and leadership play an even more important role. Yonetseva and Chimney reported similar changes in governing modes in Japan. Faldenhorf reported again similar changes in governing of higher education for the United Kingdom, although in critical terms. Faldenhorf indicated that over time the change in governance modes replaced in many modern universities with towering hierarchies exercising power without much evidence of accountability. They run institutions that are in an economic competition with each other, employing members of staff who are in competition for titles and payment, and attracting students who understand themselves to be in competition for jobs. These are the implications of forces of change for Western developed countries. However, developing or middle-level developed countries are not exempt from the same trend. The same trend toward transforming of the university has been equally valid for middle-level developed and developing countries, according to Altbach, Salmi, and Marginson. We can observe the same trend for Czech Republic and Slovak Republic. We can observe the same trend in Bulgaria and Lithuania, and of course we can observe the same trend in China. Change in governance modes of Chinese universities after the 985 initiative, change into government-driven to internally driven, change from adaptive to proactive, and from localized to systemic modes of governance is evident in Chinese higher education system as well. Of course, the same trend is equally valid for my own country, for Turkey. Starting from 1981, we have been trying to introduce new modes of governance into Turkish higher education. So shifting from more loosely coupled system into more centralized, more tightly coupled system, introducing a semi-autonomous higher education system, introducing a standardization and unification in higher education system, developing new modes of academic program delivery are some of the implications of force of change on the Turkish higher education system. We argue that these transformations have resulted in what we call identity crisis in higher education. Universities are unique organizations which have developed a unique value system throughout their history. It is not possible to assume that these transformations, both at sector or organization levels, do not touch the cultures and value systems. Different scholars have confirmed that transformations experienced by higher education institutions have shaken up their values, their beliefs, and their norms. As depicted above for different country contexts, the change and transformation trends in the world require readaptation and redefinition of the values of the universities. Ever since the beginning of the trends calling for transforming higher education institutions, many scholars indicated a dilemma between the forces working for keeping the traditional organizational configuration and cultural properties on the one hand, and the forces pressing for changing and replacing the already existing characteristics. Several scholars have underlined this tension between these conflicting forces to gain superiority over another by utilizing the perspectives and the terms. Diametric forces model, isomorphism versus adaptation, organizational allomorphism, the accumulated heritage versus modern imperatives. All different concepts depict the dilemma between transformational needs and traditional properties of higher education institutions. According to Gumpert, this conflict is related to the challenge or dilemma between the history of higher education institutions and the futures of these institutions. Under the influence of these forces calling for change, in addition to traditional ideals and deeply rooted values of higher education institutions are challenged, and these institutions have left only with a struggle to maintain balance between the conflicting forces, but also with more complex mission to fulfill. The roles and responsibilities of academic leaders have also changed. So capacity to transform the university while keeping the focus on three missions is a real challenge. Dealing with these changes require new modes of management and new leadership approaches or styles in the academy. Pace and scale of transformation have resulted in outcomes going beyond original intention of reforms and assume that European countries may need to reform their reforms or re-regulating the changes coming along with recent reform movements. Well, a common mistake that we do when we try to respond to forces of change is related to underestimating the impact of these transformations on academic culture. It is true that we are living in what we call age of change or transformation, and we need, of course, to respond to these changes and transformations. However, we need to carefully calculate the impact of these changes and transformations on academic cultures, specifically on mission, vision, and value system of higher education institutions. We undertake huge changes, but we ignore to think about the impact of these changes on culture and vice versa. In many cases, according to our observations, resistance of academics, resistance of different stakeholders in the academy towards these changes results from the tension between force of change and cultural dynamics. Because in many cases we observe a mismatch between organizational actions which are introduced to respond to these forces of change and the already existing cultural elements. Unfortunately, there is not a magical solution to the identity crisis that I indicated before. However, academic leaders may adopt transformational leadership characteristics when they try to respond to transformational changes emanating from their environment. They should count on the fact that transformational change have implications on the mission and vision of their institutions, and touching the mission and vision of the institution may have implications on the dominant cultures of their, again, institutions. So 3 key questions may help them in responding to the changes while identifying the new academic culture for their own institutions. First, how do we want to conduct our business, or how do we do the things around here? Second, how do we want to treat our key stakeholders? And third, what do we value? That is, what do we really care about? Are some of the key questions which may guide academic leaders in developing a value system, a cultural system which aligns with their mission and vision in the effort of responding to the forces of change. We argue that building transformational leadership capacity is one way of coping with the change era in higher education. Transformational leadership has a potential to fill the gap between ever-increasing forces pressing for change and the taken for granted values of the academy, which demand stability. So transformational leadership has been indicated as a well-suited form of leadership for turbulent environments. So transformational leadership initiates cultural change through conceiving a new vision, realigning it with the situated culture, and reconfigure the cultural values, norms, and assumptions shared by the participants accordingly. The stages of transformational leadership, I mean individualized consideration, intellectual stimulation, inspirational motivation, and idealized influence, indicate or suggest certain behavioral patterns in adopting or for adopting transformational leadership. However, we can identify some specific leadership actions which may help to enact transformational leadership in the academic context. Demonstrating shared leadership, demonstrating individual and collective problem solving, and consulting people and empowering them in decision making are some of the key transformational leadership actions which can be adopted by academic leadership as well. So, utilizing transformational leadership as a tool to respond to disruptions require focusing the organization on the demand for change, attracting the organization to create a mechanism for cultural development, communicating the need for change with a message or a vision that clarifies the leadership style, followed by subsequent alterations in processes, roles, and practices relevant to change, inspiring the followers to take action, to take role in the change, and creating symbols for cultural change are some of the other actions of leadership in transformational change. Trust building is another key ingredient of transformational leadership. Creating a psychologically safe environment in which people feel safe and free to be creative, risk taker, and experimenter, creating formal training opportunities, providing resources, coaching, and feedback, and serving as a positive role model are some of the actions that academic leaders may undertake in order to establish a positive change environment. As a concluding remark, we would like to suggest academic leaders to keep in mind one simple change management rule. And this is, you cannot transform a university on an old culture. Transformational change requires going beyond simple bureaucracies or even going beyond professional bureaucracies, which we use when we analyze organizational characteristics of universities. In many cases, academic leaders push their academics, their students to change. However, the leaders themselves keep the same. Without adopting new mental models, without developing new mindsets and thinking beyond the current order, transformational change is almost impossible in academic context. In addition to this brief coverage on the relationship between transformational change, academic leadership, and academic culture, I think as practitioners and scholars working on the field, we need to focus on three different orientations further. First, how to enact transformational leadership in universities. Second, what constitutes a transformational leadership in academic context. And third, cross-cultural differences in transformational leadership practices are three basic orientations that we need to further discuss or elaborate on. Well, this speech is largely informed by our chapter in the very recent LEAD book series, which entitled as Academic Leadership for Cultural Transformation in Higher Education, together with my young colleague Merve Zaim Kurtay. For further elaborations, please refer to our chapter. Thank you.